We can wait. You want to wait to get this on camera? I just feel like...
I mean, we're recording, right?
Are we recording?
I'd rather just start.
Yeah,
I
me
don't really
too.
have a big introduction.
Yeah, cool. I like that. I like that.
If I can, one word, blessed.
Way up.
Hashtag blessed or blessed?
Hashtag blessed. Way
blessed.
up, I feel blessed.
You got a new album coming out?
Yep,
Purpose?
yep,
This is a different album for you.
it is. Yeah, it's more grown up. It's,
Every few months, the internet seems to wake up with the same uneasy question. What's going on with Justin Bieber? It doesn't arrive gently. It never does. It comes wrapped in thumbnails, captions, and half-second clips frozen at the worst possible moment. A tired face. A blank stare. A pause that lasts just a second too long. And suddenly, everyone knows the answer. Or at least they think they do. He's spiraling. He's broke. He's not okay. He's finished. The certainty is always louder than the evidence. What's strange is that none of this is new. Justin Bieber has been declared done more times than most artists ever get declared successful. And yet, here he still is. Alive, creating, reappearing, refusing to disappear the way the story keeps insisting he should. So the real question isn't what's wrong with him. The real question is why the world keeps needing something to be wrong. Because if you zoom out just a little, a disturbing pattern starts to form. One that doesn't begin with Justin Bieber, and definitely doesn't end with him. A pattern where young stars are elevated, consumed, dissected, and then discarded. All while the system responsible stays comfortably invisible. And once you notice that pattern, Bieber stops looking like a mystery. He starts looking like a case study. Justin Bieber didn't enter fame gradually. There was no warm-up period, no adjustment phase, no time to test boundaries or retreat from mistakes. His childhood didn't fade into adulthood. It was overridden by it. At 13 years old, his voice was everywhere. Not locally, not nationally, globally. Millions of people who had never met him felt like they knew him, and millions more felt entitled to decide who he was supposed to be. That kind of exposure doesn't just change your life, it interrupts development. When people talk about child stars, they often focus on money or privilege, as if those things somehow neutralize pressure. But pressure doesn't care about bank accounts. In fact, money often makes it worse, because it convinces adults that the child is handling it, when in reality, the child has no choice. Adolescence is supposed to be private. It's when identity forms quietly, through trial and error, through embarrassing phases, through mistakes no one remembers 5 years later. Bieber didn't get that luxury. His learning curve was public, permanent, archived. Every emotional reaction became a headline. Every experiment became a controversy. Every bad decision became proof that something was wrong with him. And the most dangerous part, there was no off switch. When a normal teenager feels overwhelmed, they go home. When Bieber felt overwhelmed, the cameras followed him there. When he reacted, the reaction became content. And when that content went viral, it reinforced the same cycle that caused the reaction in the first place. That's not growth, that's entrapment. And it creates a specific kind of damage, one that doesn't show up immediately, but compounds over time. Here's something most people don't realize. When a child becomes famous at that scale, they don't just lose privacy, they lose authorship over their own identity. Decisions start being made for them, not with them. Image, schedule, behavior, apologies, silence. Adults step in, managers, executives, advisors, all with different incentives, but the same unspoken rule: protect the asset. And that word matters. Because once a human being becomes an asset, the question stops being, is this healthy? And becomes, is this profitable? That's how kids end up in adult environments far too early. Not necessarily illegal ones, not always scandalous ones, but environments loaded with expectations, power dynamics, and normalization of things they're not equipped to process yet. People call it growing up fast. But growing up fast is just another way of saying growing up without protection. And when you're taught early that love is conditional on performance, that attention disappears when you slow down, and that mistakes cost millions. You don't develop stability. You develop survival instincts. Survival instincts look like rebellion to outsiders, or entitlement, or self-destruction. But inside, it's just a nervous system that never learned how to rest. By the time Bieber reached his late teens, the warning signs were already there. Exhaustion masked as attitude, acting out reframed as arrogance, boundary pushing is treated as betrayal instead of distress. And here's where the narrative gets cruel. The same media that celebrated his rise began narrating his decline with enthusiasm. Mistakes weren't just mistakes, they were proof. Proof that fame ruins kids. Proof that success corrupts. Proof that he was ungrateful, unstable, or broken. Rarely did anyone ask the obvious question. What happens when you take a developing brain, expose it to global scrutiny, surround it with adults who benefit from compliance, and remove every normal mechanism for learning and recovery? The answer isn't a mystery. It's inevitable. But inevitability doesn't sell. Drama does. As Bieber grew older, the public story hardened into something even more dangerous. Expectation of collapse. People didn't just observe his behavior, they waited for it to confirm what they already believed. A bad interview became evidence. A cancelled appearance became a theory. A tired expression became a diagnosis. And the internet, in particular, became obsessed with solving him. As if he were a puzzle, a mystery box, something to be decoded rather than understood. That obsession stripped him of humanity. Because once someone becomes content, their pain stops being a signal and starts being entertainment. Concern turns into speculation. Speculation turns into narrative. Narrative turns into clicks. And clicks are profitable. What makes this even darker is that the system learned this pattern decades ago. It knows that audiences don't just like success stories, they crave downfall arcs. Redemption only works after collapse. Sympathy only works after spectacle. So the pressure doesn't ease with age. It intensifies. By adulthood, Bieber wasn't just carrying the weight of fame. He was carrying the expectations of an audience conditioned to believe they were entitled to his unraveling. And that's when the next layer of the story begins, because fame alone doesn't destroy people. Control does. And in the music industry, control is rarely obvious, but it's always present. By the time Bieber entered his 20s, he wasn't just a star, he was a system unto himself. Contracts, tours, merchandise, entire ecosystems built around his output. And ecosystems don't care about burnout, they care about continuity. Which meant that even when his body slowed down, the machine didn't. Even when his health faltered, expectations stayed the same. Even when he tried to retreat, the spotlight followed. This is where many artists quietly disappear. They burn out, retreat, or fade into obscurity. But Bieber couldn't do that, not without consequences. Too many people depended on him staying visible. Too much money was attached to his presence, so instead of disappearing, he fractured in public. And the public interpreted that fracture exactly the wrong way, not as a system failure, but as a personal one. What's uncomfortable is that none of this shocked the industry. It shocked the audience, because the audience is fed the illusion that fame equals fulfillment, that wealth insulates against pain, that success cancels out trauma. But those inside the system know better. They've seen this movie before. Different faces, same outcome, which raises an even more unsettling question. If this pattern is so obvious, if it's happened so many times, why do we keep pretending it's unexpected? And more importantly, who benefits from pretending? Because the moment you start asking that, Justin Bieber's story stops being about him entirely and becomes about the machine that built him. By the time Justin Bieber reached adulthood, the most dangerous part of fame wasn't the attention anymore. It was the infrastructure around him. Because once a child star survives long enough, the industry stops treating them like talent and starts treating them like territory. Everyone has a role. Managers, lawyers, tour executives, brand partners, publicists. Each one positioned as support, but all tied to the same outcome: keep the machine running. On paper, this looks like protection. In reality, it often becomes controlled. And control doesn't usually arrive as force. It arrives as guidance, as advice, as a concern, as this is how things work. Over time, decisions that should belong to the artist quietly shift into rooms they're not invited into. Schedules get tighter, contracts get longer, silence gets negotiated. And the artist learns a critical lesson very early. Pushing back has consequences. The music industry doesn't operate on chaos, it operates on access. Who introduces you to whom, which rooms you're allowed into, which conversations happen without you. Mentorship, especially for young artists, is less about teaching and more about positioning. If someone opens doors for you, they also decide which ones stay closed. That creates a subtle imbalance. Gratitude becomes expectation. Loyalty becomes an obligation. And questioning the system starts to feel dangerous, not because anyone threatens you outright, but because you know how easily access can disappear. For someone like Bieber, this dynamic began long before he had the language to recognize it. Adults around him spoke for him, negotiated for him, interpreted his behavior for the public. And when mistakes happened, as they always do, the response wasn't reflection. It was damage control. Fix the image, redirect the narrative, keep moving. There was no pause to ask why the mistakes were happening in the first place. Because pausing costs money. Here's the uncomfortable truth most fans never see. When an artist reaches Bieber's level, they stop being surrounded by people who can afford honesty. Everyone's livelihood becomes tied to the artist's output. Which means telling the truth, especially uncomfortable truth, risks destabilizing the entire structure. So, concern gets filtered. Warnings get softened. Red flags get reframed as phases. And when the artist feels overwhelmed, isolated, or confused, the response is often the same. Keep working. Stay busy. Don't slow down. Momentum fixes everything. Except it doesn't. It just delays the crash. This is where speculation thrives. Because when transparency disappears, rumor fills the gap. Fans sense something is off, but they're never given enough information to understand why. So they build theories. Online communities dissect body language. Old clips resurface. Every association becomes suspicious. Every silence becomes loaded. The artist becomes less human and more symbolic. And the internet doesn't ask whether speculation is fair. It asks whether it's engaging. That's how whispers turn into narratives. Narratives turn into certainty. And certainty becomes punishment. But none of this happens in a vacuum. It happens because the system refuses to speak honestly, and then acts surprised when people start guessing. Another layer of control appears when an artist's image becomes inseparable from their profitability. By Bieber's early 20s, his brand wasn't just music, it was youth, desire, relatability, accessibility. Anything that threatened that image became a problem, not because it was harmful, but because it was inconvenient. Struggle is only acceptable when it can be packaged. Vulnerability is welcome when it fits a redemption arc. But genuine instability? That's a liability. So the response isn't care. It's containment. Appearances get canceled quietly. Statements get drafted carefully. Behavior gets managed behind closed doors while the public is fed reassurance. Everything is fine. Everything is under control. Until it isn't. And when it finally spills over, the system does something remarkable. It distances itself. Suddenly the narrative shifts. The same people who once spoke for the artist step back. The machine that demanded constant output reframes the collapse as personal failure. Responsibility flows downward, never upward. The artist becomes the problem. What makes this especially dangerous for someone like Bieber is that he never had a pre-fame self to return to. There was no before. No stable identity untouched by contracts, branding, or expectations. So when the system pulls away, even slightly, it doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like abandonment, and abandonment hits harder when it comes after years of conditional support. This is where silence becomes the most powerful currency in the industry. Artists learn quickly that speaking openly has consequences. You're labeled difficult, unstable, unreliable. Doors close quietly. Opportunities dry up without explanation. The punishment isn't loud, it's invisible. So instead of speaking, artists retreat. They post vaguely. They hint. They disappear for a while. They try to reclaim control in small, indirect ways. The audience interprets this as secrecy. But often, it's fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of triggering legal issues. Fear of being framed as ungrateful. Fear of being blamed for the very damage the system helped create. And once fear takes root, it doesn't just silence speech. It distorts behavior. By this point in Bieber's life, The cracks weren't subtle anymore. Fatigue, withdrawal, a visible shift in energy. But instead of slowing the machine, the response was to analyze him harder. Was he okay? Was he struggling? Was something being hidden? Each question implied suspicion, not empathy. And the irony is brutal. The more the system tightens control, the more chaotic the outcome becomes. Because pressure doesn't disappear when ignored. It accumulates. And when it finally releases, it does so publicly. Which gives the media exactly what it wants. There's a reason so many artists describe fame as isolating. It's not because they lack people around them. It's because they lack people who aren't benefiting from them. That distinction matters. When everyone around you needs you to function, rest feels like betrayal. Slowing down feels selfish. Saying no feels dangerous. And asking for help feels like weakness. So artists push through. They numb. They distract. They cope however they can. And when that coping looks messy from the outside, the world responds with judgment instead of curiosity. Because judgment is easier. By now, the pattern should feel familiar. Early fame. Accelerated adulthood. Control disguised as protection. Silence enforced by fear. Speculation filling the gaps. And finally, the artist being framed as unstable when the pressure becomes visible. This isn't unique, it's systemic. And once you see it clearly, the next chapter of Bieber's story makes uncomfortable sense. Because the moment control tightens, something else inevitably comes into play. Money. And money in this system doesn't just complicate things, it exposes them. Money is supposed to simplify things. In reality, for someone like Justin Bieber, it complicated everything. Because wealth at that scale doesn't arrive cleanly. It arrives layered with expectations, obligations, and invisible debts that most people never see. When fans hear numbers, they imagine freedom. What they don't see are the contracts attached to those numbers, the tours that must happen, the appearances that can't be skipped, the momentum that has to be maintained. By the time Bieber reached his 20s, money wasn't just income, it was leverage. Every decision carried weight beyond personal preference. Canceling a tour didn't just mean disappointing fans. It meant triggering financial consequences that rippled outward. Production costs, staffing, venues, legal commitments already locked in months or years earlier. So when Bieber slowed down, it wasn't framed as recovery. It was framed as a risk. This is why moments that look like freedom to the public often signal pressure behind the scenes. When an artist sells off something deeply personal, like ownership over their work, fans tend to see it as a cash grab or a sign of decline. But in reality, these decisions are often about liquidity, about certainty, about reducing exposure. It's not always desperation. Sometimes it's survival. And that's the part that rarely gets discussed honestly. Because admitting that someone who appears unimaginably wealthy might still feel financially cornered disrupts the fantasy people cling to. So, instead of nuance, the narrative simplifies. He's broke. He mismanaged everything. He fell off. Stories like that are easier to digest than the truth. That modern celebrity wealth often looks massive on paper while being tightly controlled in practice. At the same time, another storyline began gaining traction. Health. Every visible change became evidence. A stiff movement, a distant expression, a cancelled appearance. Suddenly, the internet wasn't just watching, it was diagnosing. Medical terms entered comment sections. Old interviews resurfaced, context vanished. Every clip was stripped of its moment and reframed as part of a larger decline. And this is where the line between concern and consumption disappeared completely. Because once health becomes content, empathy turns conditional. People say they care, but only as long as the story remains dramatic. Recovery is boring, stability doesn't trend. What performs is uncertainty. So every update was interpreted through the lens of collapse. If he looked tired, something was wrong. If he smiled, it was performative. If he stayed silent, he was hiding something. There was no correct response. The internet doesn't handle ambiguity well. It demands answers. And when answers aren't provided quickly enough, it fills the gaps itself. Not maliciously, but relentlessly. Forums, reaction videos, speculative breakdowns. All fueled by the same belief: if someone is famous enough, their inner life is public property. That belief is rarely questioned. Instead, it's monetized. Creators build entire channels around reading between the lines. Clips get slowed down, facial expressions analyzed, normal human behavior reframed as coded messages. Viewers are encouraged to feel like investigators rather than spectators. And once that happens, the subject stops being human. They become a case. This is especially dangerous when it intersects with health struggles, because illness doesn't follow a narrative arc. It doesn't rise cleanly or resolve on schedule. Recovery isn't linear. Some days are better, some days aren't. And when millions of people are watching, fluctuation becomes suspicious. Why does he look better here but worse there? Why did he cancel this but attend that? Why hasn't he explained himself? As if explanations were owed, as if healing were a performance. What makes this cycle brutal is how quickly compassion turns into entitlement. People begin by saying they're worried, then they demand transparency, then they accuse, and finally, they decide. Once the crowd decides something is wrong, every piece of information gets filtered through that conclusion. Contradictory evidence doesn't matter. Improvement doesn't count. The story has already been written, and stories, once written, resist revision. Meanwhile, Bieber himself was doing what many people do when overwhelmed by noise. He pulled inward. Fewer appearances, less explanation, more distance. To the public, this looked suspicious. To anyone who has ever been burned by overexposure, it looked familiar. Silence wasn't strategy. It was self-preservation. But silence, in this environment, is interpreted as confirmation. And that's where things spiral. Here's the paradox that traps celebrities. Speak openly, and you lose control over your words. Stay quiet, and others speak for you. Either way, the narrative moves forward, without your consent. And when the narrative involves money, health, and stability, it becomes impossible to correct without making things worse. Say you're struggling, and you're labeled unstable. Say you're fine, and you're accused of lying. Say nothing, and speculation explodes. There is no winning move. This is where the system reveals its most unsettling feature. It doesn't just tolerate speculation, it depends on it. Media cycles need constant tension. Platforms reward engagement. Algorithms favor controversy. And audiences, conditioned by years of collapsed stories, expect a payoff. Someone must fall. And if the fall doesn't come naturally, it gets imagined. What's rarely acknowledged is how exhausting it is to live inside that expectation. Imagine waking up every day knowing that millions of people are waiting for proof that you're unraveling. Not because they hate you, but because they've been trained to believe that's how these stories end. The pressure isn't just external. It becomes internalized. Every bad day feels dangerous, every vulnerability feels risky, every misstep feels amplified, and over time, that kind of hypervigilance reshapes behavior. People don't become unstable because they're weak. They become unstable because they're never allowed to be unstable in private. And this is where the financial narrative and the health narrative merge. Because when people believe someone is declining, they also believe they're losing control. Over money, over relationships, over themselves. The stories reinforce each other, even when there's no direct evidence linking them. It becomes a single, collapsing storyline. And once that storyline takes hold, it stops being about facts. It becomes about satisfaction. But there's a twist the audience rarely anticipates. Because sometimes, instead of collapsing, the person at the center of the storm does something unexpected. They stop playing the role. They stop feeding the narrative. They stop trying to convince the crowd. And when that happens, the system panics, because it doesn't know how to handle someone who refuses to perform their own downfall. That moment, the refusal, is where Justin Bieber's story begins to change. Not into redemption, but into resistance. And that's where the pattern breaks. By the time the world started asking whether Justin Bieber was the next anything, the pattern was already decades old. Different era, different industries, same outcome. Young stars rise fast, burn hot, and then falter publicly. The public treats it like coincidence. The industry treats it like collateral. And the audience, often without realizing it, treats it like entertainment. What rarely changes is the framing. When a child star struggles, the story isn't about the system that accelerated their adulthood. It's about their personal weakness, their lack of discipline, their inability to handle success. That framing is convenient. Because it absolves everyone else. History is filled with examples that follow this exact arc. Kids are pushed into global attention before they can form boundaries. Adolescents turned into brands. Adults expected to carry trauma quietly while continuing to perform. The details vary. The headlines change. But the mechanics remain the same. Pressure. Isolation. Control. Collapse. And the moment the collapse becomes visible, the narrative hardens. Sympathy is replaced by judgment. Concern is replaced by diagnosis. The system steps back and lets the individual absorb the blame. It's efficient. It protects the machine. Justin Bieber reached the point most stars never do, the moment where the audience starts comparing timelines. Is this another Britney? Is this another Michael? Is this how it always ends? The comparisons weren't random. They were learned, conditioned by decades of watching the same story play out. But something different happened this time. Justin didn't disappear the way people expected. He didn't fully collapse. He didn't stage a dramatic breakdown. He didn't play into the spectacle. Instead, he did something far less satisfying for the machine. He slowed down. Slowing down doesn't look heroic. It doesn't trend. It doesn't produce viral clips. But in an industry that thrives on constant output, slowing down is an act of defiance. It disrupts schedules. It frustrates expectations. It creates uncertainty. Not about the artist, but about the system's ability to control the narrative. And Bieber's slowdown wasn't framed as a comeback. It wasn't packaged as redemption. It was quieter than that. Messier, more human. Which made it harder to monetize. Then came the pivot that most people misunderstood. New creative choices. Unfamiliar sounds. Less polished presentation. Projects that didn't chase charts as aggressively as before. Not because success was no longer possible, but because success was no longer the sole objective. For the first time in his career, Bieber appeared to be choosing expression over optimization. And that terrified people. Because when an artist stops chasing approval, the system loses leverage. This is the part the headlines struggled with. If he wasn't collapsing, then what was happening? If he wasn't disappearing, then why wasn't he explaining himself? If he wasn't chasing relevance, then what was the angle? The truth is, there wasn't one. And that's what made it disruptive. At the same time, Bieber began diversifying in ways that weren't tied directly to public validation. Creative outlets that didn't require instant applause. Projects that didn't hinge on chart placement. Spaces where he could exist without being evaluated every second. That's not a retreat, that's boundary setting, and boundaries are dangerous to systems built on access. The most telling shift wasn't in his output, it was in his posture. Less apology, less over-explanation, less visible anxiety about perception. Not arrogance, distance. The kind of distance that comes when someone stops trying to win an argument they never agreed to participate in. This wasn't a clean transformation. It wasn't aesthetic. It didn't come with a clear narrative arc. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because the system relies on predictability. On roles being played correctly. On stars either shining or falling. Not quietly redefining the terms. Here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Hollywood doesn't fear failure. It fears autonomy. Failure can be repackaged. Autonomy cannot. When an artist fails, the system explains it away. When an artist takes control, the system loses authority. And that's what Justin Bieber accidentally exposed. Not through accusation, but through behavior. He exposed how fragile the machine actually is. How much it depends on young people not knowing their worth. How much it relies on constant access to their inner lives. How quickly concern turns into control when profit is involved. And most importantly, how uncomfortable it becomes when someone refuses to be consumed the way the story expects. The uncomfortable truth is this. Justin Bieber didn't just survive fame. He survived the audience's expectations of his destruction. And that's rare. Because audiences don't like unfinished stories. They want conclusions. They want closure. They want either triumph or tragedy. What they don't want is ambiguity. And Bieber chose ambiguity. That choice forces a mirror back onto everyone watching. Why are we so quick to believe someone is falling apart? Why do we feel entitled to proof of their suffering? Why does a young person's pain feel like public property once they become famous? Those questions don't feel good, which is why they're usually avoided. The dark side of Hollywood isn't hidden in secret rooms or whispered rumors. It's hiding in plain sight. In this way, success is extracted early. In this way, pressure is normalized. In this way, breakdowns are framed as personal flaws instead of systemic outcomes. In this way, children are turned into cultural products before they understand consent. Justin Bieber didn't expose this with a tell-all interview. He exposed it by living long enough to step sideways. And that's why his story unsettles people. Because it refuses to end the way we've been trained to expect. It doesn't give us a clean villain. It doesn't give us a neat redemption arc. It doesn't let us walk away feeling morally superior. Instead, it leaves us with something far more uncomfortable. Responsibility. If young stars are being fed into a system that profits from their instability, then the problem isn't just executives or contracts or paparazzi, it's also in demand. Demand for access, demand for explanation, demand for collapse. And until that demand changes, the machine won't. So the next time a tired clip trends, the next time speculation feels tempting, the next time a young artist's silence feels suspicious, it's worth asking a different question. Not, what's wrong with them, but what are we expecting to see? Because sometimes the darkest thing being exposed isn't the celebrity, it's us. Before you click away, take a second and sit with what this story really means. This wasn't just about Justin Bieber, it was about a system that turns children into products, pressure into profit, and silence into survival. A system that looks glamorous on the surface, but underneath demands a price most people never see. At Silver Veil, we don't tell these stories to tear people down, we tell them to lift the curtain, to look past headlines, past rumors, past easy narratives, and expose the hidden forces shaping fame, power, and identity. Because once you see how this machine works, you can't unsee it. If this video made you think differently, if it made you uncomfortable in the right way, then you're exactly who this channel is for. There's another story waiting for you, one that goes even deeper behind the veil. Watch it next.